welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, are the milk wars really hurting dairy farmers? Why scamming is becoming a growth industry in Australia? And why Lady Gaga is doing her na-na over breast milk ice cream. Our panel tonight, CEO of Rate City, Damien Smith, social media strategist and former advisor to Malcolm Turnbull, Tommy Tudor-Hope, and John Barron from ABC News Radio. Well, Julia Gillard has been warned that industry expects more generous compensation under the government's new carbon pricing plan than it was due to receive under Kevin Rudd's CPRS. In a piece published in The Australian today, Rio Tinto's managing director David Peever says a carbon price will be disastrous for any business that can't pass on extra cost to consumers. He argues the failure to reach a global agreement on greenhouse gas targets means Kevin Rudd's carbon plan is not an appropriate starting point for discussions in 2011. But Climate Change Minister Greg Combet says that's not true.
Perhaps Mr Peever, understandably, wasn't at Mexico at the Cancun conference, but the fact of the matter is that the international negotiations got back on track last December. I had the opportunity, of course, to be involved. And what it meant was that for the first time, the pledges made by all those nations under the Copenhagen Accord have been included in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process. That is a significant step forward.
Tommy, do Rio Tinto need more generous compensation given their profits just trebled in the last year?
Well, I guess that's something they'll come to over the next 6 months, but I think his base point is essentially correct. The negotiations or the discussions they had with Kevin Rudd in 2009 was under a totally different circumstance than it is now, especially with Copenhagen being out of the way. But I think more concern to Julia Gillard is now that she's being under attack from big business on one hand and on the unions. And this is the problem. If you announce a policy with no details, you basically give everybody open slather to criticise you for whatever you want.
He is right that the ground has shifted. It's shifted in Rio Tinto's favour. They're more profitable than they were a couple of years ago.
Well, profit is one thing, but what impact this carbon tax will have on Rio, that's the real issue. That's the issue that Rio will need to have to put on the table, and that's the real issue that Julia Gillard is going to have to negotiate with Rio.
Damien, I'm sure if your business profits were being eroded by a tax, you'd be speaking out too, wouldn't you?
Look, he's clearly looking after the interests of his shareholders. That's a legitimate thing for him to be doing. But yet again, the old saying of rent seekers unite does seem to sum up a lot of what Australian business does. And, to say that Rio Tinto has not been in a position to pass on cost increases to its consumers is a little bit misleading. Rio Tinto's consumers, largely in China and India, have had a lot of cost increases passed on to them in the last few years. They're paying substantially higher prices, and the reason that profits are up for companies like that is not that they're suddenly massively more productive. It's people are paying a lot more for the stuff that they're selling.
Tommy, is this rent-seeking?
I don't think so, no. He's entitled to make a point. He's one of Australia's foremost business leaders, and he's entitled to make the case. But, this is the discussion we'll be having over the next 6 months, I guess.
John, he's making that case, but what's the likelihood? I mean, we're talking about a situation here where the Greens opposed the Kevin Rudd CPRS because it was giving too much compensation to industry. Now they've got a lot of clout, so it's unlikely that Labor's going to give more compensation if they're going to get a deal.
Yeah, it's right. And, the irony here is you open a discussion, it quickly becomes a debate and then descends into a screaming argument, and that's what we're likely to see. We're seeing ambit claims from all sides. Businesses saying, this is going to cost us a lot. Unions saying, this could cost us a lot of jobs. Everybody's putting in their 2 cents worth at the moment, and it will get a little bit carried away. We will be seeing pretty soon what the Greens are going to make as their bottom line as well. And this is a process, for goodness sake, we went through this for months and months and months last year. I think a lot of the Australian voters really want to say, look, just wake me up when it's all over. Tell me what's going to happen, because clearly the business community has said this is going to happen. It's going to happen in July next year. So let's just work with it and make sure it's something we can work with.
Tommy, Essential Media have been trying to get a pulse today of what voters think about the announcement so far, and they said in their poll that 48% of voters opposed the government's carbon pricing announcement, 35% in support.
Yeah, that comes of no surprise to me. That's what happens when you announce a policy with Rob Oakeshott and Bob Brown. This is the biggest economic change, structural change to our economy when Julia Gillard announced this, it should have been Greg Combay there, it should have been Wayne Swan, it should have been Julia Gillard. That's the agenda she should have set. By having a circus with Oakeshott, Windsor, Brown, Christine Milne, she sent absolutely the wrong message and off the wrong foot in this debate. And I think that's reflected in the polls this week.
Damien, was it a circus the way they announced it?
Oh, well, I think that there's not many things that aren't a circus in terms of how you get legislation through Parliament right now, I think, to be fair. But no, I think Tommy's got a fair point on that. But the reality is Australia survived tariff reductions. Australia survived a GST. If we play the tape back to the 1980s or the 1990s, then unions and government and business, everyone thought the sky was going to fall in both those cases. And
but in the case of tariffs, it did hurt Labor's base, didn't it? A lot of blue-collar workers lost their jobs.
Absolutely, but on balance, Australia is a better place for it. Australia is a richer place for not having those tariff barriers in place than it was before. And, I think it's imperative that the government does get on the front foot about this because, economic reforms like this do have winners and losers, to be sure, but ultimately they're the right thing to do.
As part of that essential polling today, 59% of voters agreed with the statement the PM has broken an election promise and should wait until after the next election before introducing a carbon pollution tax. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think that the debate has been very effectively painted that way. I think Abbott, in his inimitable style, has managed to corner the argument very quickly and got the argument on that one alone. But at the end of the day, voters are going to get the chance to vote on this. It's not that far away. Voters will get a very clear chance in 2013 to decide on this. It's not like that 2013 election will be held under false pretences.
And John, Tony Abbott's called for a people's revolt on this, and it sounds like there's some rallies due this month against the carbon tax.
Yes, the anti-carbon tax activists are revolting, and they're organising in ways rather reminiscent of the anti-tax Tea Party movement in the United States. Again, the rabbles being roused by right-wing media. In this case, it's commercial talk radio in Sydney, which is undergoing a little sort of internal war of its own at the moment. Who can be more conservative between the shock jocks? And
but there's nothing wrong with getting people out on the streets voicing their opinions, is there, John?
Not at all. And in many cases, they are people with honest, truly held beliefs. They're sometimes manipulated, though, by people who have other agendas, and it's always rather instructive to have a look at the people behind them, or indeed the people behind those people. Who's going to be paying for these websites they're organising people? Who's going to be paying for the placards? Who is going to be saying, these people, these 10,000 people that came out on the streets today, they speak for me? Is it going to be shock jocks? Is it going to be business interests? We should turn a sceptical eye to this, but also understand that a lot of people just don't want to pay another tax because they don't feel they can afford it.
Tommy, what's your reading of these protests that are coming?
No, I don't buy into the conspiracy theory about shock jocks and all the rest. I think people are rightly angry about the broken promise, and that was quite clear. But people are entitled to protest. I don't think we'll see anything like what we've seen in America with the Tea Party. It's a very different sort of movement over there based on more fiscal conservatism and spending than the climate change carbon tax debate we're having here. But I don't think we'll see mass protests like we did in America.
Tommy, last week your old boss Malcolm Turnbull was asked if he could name an economist who was supportive of the Coalition's carbon reduction plan, and he couldn't come up with any. Does the Coalition have their own weak point here?
Well, I don't think that's right. I think, Andrew Robb, I think on Insiders yesterday said there were a few. I think Sinclair Davidson from RMIT.
I think he named two.
Yeah, Danny Price, who I did some work with back in 2009 with Malcolm on the
Who then rung up the Coalition and said he didn't support it,
Not quite right. I think he said, it's a better plan than Labor's plan. I don't say I endorse it, but that's a bit of conjure. But I think Sinclair Davidson...
According to the papers, he said, though, that it added up, but it didn't
I would never question what the papers say. But, no, I think some economists have, but that is a problem. Third-party endorsements are a key plank of any policy sell. Julia Gillard will have her own challenges in that regard, but I think, people have criticised the Coalition for that. But let's remember, it's not the Coalition introducing a carbon tax this week, it's actually Labor's tax that is a real debate.
Damien, do you see some weak points there for Labor to hit?
Oh, look, absolutely. Life is full of delicious ironies, but the fact that a Labor government is advocating something relatively close over the next few years to a market-based solution for carbon pricing, and the Liberal Party is advocating spending billions of dollars investing in its choice of technologies to solve carbon problems is an astonishing irony. The only thing that actually doesn't astonish me is that I think we all know Tony Abbott represents the last throes of the Democratic Labor Party. Tony Abbott may well believe in big government on these things. I think what's astonishing to me is someone as smart as Malcolm Turnbull manages to carry off the fiction that he supports this. One of the reasons why I think a lot of people who have political views, such as myself, get turned off by politics is that we all know that Malcolm Turnbull doesn't really believe this. We all know he's parroting a party line. We all know he believes in market signals because markets tend to work on this stuff, and yet he has to sit there and pretend that this stuff is actually his idea and that it's legitimate. We all know that's not true.
And it's been a hard argument too, hasn't it, for Greg Hunt to argue, given that his whole thesis at university that I think Peter Martin published today. Yeah. Not that we want all our views from university on the public record, but
or behaviour.
Yeah, that's true. But Peter Martin published that on his blog today, and back then he was arguing for a carbon price well ahead of a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I think it's naive in the extreme to think everybody in one party is going to believe everything of that party's platform. And Greg may have had different views when he was at university. I'm sure Julia Gillard had different foreign policy views when she was at university. Malcolm might have different views now, but him and Greg are certainly playing as team players on this one. I can't see it being an issue for the coalition.
John, your thoughts?
Well, at this stage, there are less credible economists supporting Tony Abbott's scheme than credible scientists suggesting that mankind isn't responsible for climate change at the moment. And it seems that business is seeing the writing on the wall and they want to be a part of this process. And Tony Abbott is finding few allies right now.
Well, the idea of the big banks cutting interest rates independent of the Reserve Bank might sound unlikely, but that's exactly what's being forecast by Westpac Chief Executive Gail Kelly. In an interview on the ABC's News 7:30 program tonight, she says as global financial markets continue to recover, funding costs will fall and the banks will pass that money on to the customers in the form of rate cuts. Now, Damien, you're the CEO of Rate City. What do you make of this?
It would be a novel approach. One of the iron laws of interest rate setting has been that interest rates seem to only go down from commercial banks when the Reserve Bank cuts them, but they go up by formulas of their own volition. We saw that with credit cards. Credit cards is a great example. Credit card interest rates fell only by the extent that the Reserve Bank put rates down. Then they rose much, much quicker than that. It's possible, but the thing that will drive that is competition. That's not going to happen out of goodwill, and it's not just going to happen because funding costs are down. That will be part of it, but the only thing that will really drive cuts in rates or fees, the things that banks charge people, will be competition between institutions. Some signs of life there, but nowhere near enough.
John, can you see any chance of this happening?
Well, it'd be fascinating if it does. It'll prove all the sceptics wrong who were saying that, the banks, they want to have it both ways. But I think the main thing the banks have to overcome is the fact that their customers don't like the uncertainty. They don't like to get interest rate rises when the Reserve is sitting on their hands. So they have to tell us, well, OK, this international lending rate, what is it? Is it the 10-year bond rate? What is the measure so I can make plans for my household budget this year? That's what people have a right to know, what their banks are going to do. And then they'll probably be quite pragmatic and say, well, if they go up, they go up. There's nothing we can do about it. But just let me know it's going to happen rather than it just being sprung on us, I don't know, during the Melbourne Cup, for instance.
Tommy, can you see this kind of competition happening?
I think it's one of these things we have to see it to believe it. The banks in the last 12 months have certainly suffered a publicity dent and their image in the public eye is not one of extreme trust, I'd imagine.
Well, Julia Gillard and Barack Obama are due to meet later tonight. Both have had their own problems with the opinion polls of late, and while Barack Obama's popularity may have been languishing below the 50% mark for much of his presidency, it seems he's still the only horse in the race for the White House. John Barron has written a piece for the Drum website today explaining that in March 2007, ahead of the last US presidential election, there were more than a dozen serious candidates, but 4 years on, there's only one confirmed, the incumbent. So, John, why isn't anyone throwing their hat in the ring?
It's a great question. What a terrific job. President of the United States. You've got a big house, you've got lots of cars, Secret Service.
Lots of problems.
Yeah, well, there is that as well. And also the problem for anyone challenging him is, here's a guy that, for all the faults you may perceive in his first 2 and a bit years in the White House, he knows how to win the White House. He knows how to win a presidential campaign. He knows also how to raise $750 million to do it. So while there are about a dozen Republicans at the moment who are seriously toying with the idea, Newt Gingrich just last week was expected to declare his candidacy, and then suddenly one of his accountants said, not just yet. Others are out there having written books that are all about their biography and their leadership attributes, and they're touring the first to vote states like Iowa and New Hampshire, going to all the bookshops. It looks like a campaign, but nobody's actually declaring because they're going to wait a few more weeks and see, maybe I should keep my powder dry until 2016 when Obama can't run for a third term and there's no obvious successor because Joe Biden, the Vice President, isn't likely to run. Hillary Clinton has said she's not going to run, so they might decide they have a better chance then. But in the meantime, we've got this sort of phony war. Nobody's running, and yet they're all out there running in a funny sort of way.
Damien, I guess there might be someone who, like Obama, comes from nowhere.
It's possible, but remember, when there's an incumbent president, there's always going to be less candidates. I mean, clearly he's not going to get challenged by a serious candidate on his own side, so that takes out half the contenders from 2008. I think that John's hit the nail on the head, though. The amount of money we're talking about here is astonishing. What he managed to do in terms of coming from genuinely nowhere was an extraordinary achievement, but someone will have to spend several $100 million to get to the starting race of a November general election in 2012. And that's a terrifying number. And it's very hard to see more than 2 or 3 people being able to excite that passion and get that much money raised.
Tommy, who do you think might be one of those candidates?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I don't buy into the fact that